He sat by the window of a small cafe, his hands clasped tightly around a warm cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The steam had faded long ago, but he still held it as if it could calm the storm inside him. He glanced at the door for the 100th time, his heart racing each time someone walked in. It had been years since he'd gone on a date, let alone a blind one. His friend had convinced him that he needed to get out more, that he'd been alone long enough that maybe it was time to try again. But now, sitting here, every nerve in his body screamed that this was a terrible idea. He kept checking his phone, scrolling through the messages with his friend for reassurance. "She's nice, you'll like her," the last text said. "She's genuine. Trust me," he sighed. Easy for his friend to say. It wasn't his heart on the line. He took a deep breath, glancing around the cafe. It was cozy, soft music playing, a few people chatting quietly, the smell of fresh pastries in the air. It was the kind of place meant for warm moments, not nervous breakdowns. He tapped his fingers on the table, wondering what she would be like. Would she talk a lot or barely say a word? Would she notice how awkward he could be at first? Would she laugh easily? He tried to picture her face, but all he had was a first name and the promise that she'd be someone worth meeting. Minutes passed slowly. He began to doubt if she'd even show up. Maybe she'd changed her mind. Maybe she'd taken one look through the window and decided she wasn't interested. The thought made his chest tighten. Then the cafe door opened and a gust of cool air swept in. He looked up and saw her. She stepped in quietly, her coat slightly damp from the drizzle outside. Her hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and she brushed a few strands back as she looked around the cafe, searching for someone. There was something graceful about her, unhurried, calm, but with a hint of nervousness too. He froze. His heart skipped a beat. Could this be her? He stared for a moment, unsure if he should wave or wait. She pulled out her phone, glanced at it, and then looked up again. Their eyes met for just a second, and she smiled. A small, polite smile that made his chest feel lighter. She walked over to his table. "Hi," she said softly. "Are you waiting for someone?" "Yes," he managed to say, standing up quickly, almost knocking over his cup. Yes, I'm waiting for you." Her smile widened. "So you must be him," she said, setting her bag down and taking a seat. "Sorry I'm late. Traffic was terrible." He shook his head quickly. No, it's fine. I just got here myself. It was a lie." He'd been there for almost 30 minutes. But somehow saying that felt embarrassing. They both laughed nervously, the kind of laughter that happens when two strangers try to make the first few minutes less awkward. For a moment, there was silence. The kind that's both uncomfortable and familiar at the same time. He looked at her carefully, trying not to stare. But there was something about her face that tugged at a memory he couldn't quite reach. She started talking, and the sound of her voice felt oddly comforting. "So," she said, "your friend told me you're not really into blind dates either." He chuckled softly. "Yeah, you could say that. This is my first one." "Mine too," she said. "I almost canceled, honestly. But my coworker kept insisting I should go." "Well," he said with a shy smile, "I guess we both got peer pressured into this." She laughed, a gentle sound that made him relax a little. The conversation started slowly, like a cautious dance. They talked about the weather, about how they both preferred small cafes over big restaurants, about movies they liked and the awkwardness of first meetings. She was easy to talk to, even though both of them were still guarded, unsure of what to reveal and what to hold back. As she spoke, he found himself studying her expressions, the way her eyebrows lifted when she was curious, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she laughed. There was something familiar there, but he couldn't place it. He tried to shake the feeling off. Maybe she just reminded him of someone from the past. After all, everyone has a face that feels a little familiar. She told him about her job at a local design studio, about how hectic her week had been, and about how she'd almost spilled coffee on her boss that morning. He laughed, not because the story was particularly funny, but because her way of telling it was full of life. He began to notice small things, how her voice softened when she talked about her family, how her eyes lit up when she mentioned her younger brother, how she paused before answering questions that were too personal. She seemed careful yet open, as if she'd learned the balance between honesty and self-protection. He liked that about her. At one point, she asked about his work. He told her he managed a small bookstore in town. Her eyes brightened immediately. "You work in a bookstore?" she asked. That's amazing. I love the smell of old books, he smiled. Most people say that, but you'd be surprised how few actually like being surrounded by them all day. I think I would, she said. It sounds peaceful. It is, he said quietly. Sometimes too peaceful. They both smiled at that. The waiter came by, refilled their cups, and left them to their quiet conversation. Time started slipping away unnoticed. He stopped checking his phone, stopped worrying about what to say next. It felt nice. At one point, she leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, studying him curiously. You seem familiar, she said with a small frown. Have we met before? His heart skipped. He hesitated for a moment. I don't think so, he said quickly, even though something deep inside told him that wasn't true. She tilted her head, as if trying to connect a memory. Then she shook it off and smiled again. Maybe you just have one of those faces. He laughed softly, but inside his mind was racing. Where had he seen her before? As they talked more, bits of her life began to form a clearer picture. She mentioned the small town where she grew up, the school she attended, and the little park she used to visit as a child. His pulse quickened. He knew that park. He used to play there too. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't want to sound strange or make her uncomfortable. But as she described it, the big oak tree, the tiny ice cream stand at the corner, his memory sharpened. He remembered a girl who used to live across the street from that park. A girl with the same kind of laughter, the same sparkle in her eyes. Could it be her? He wanted to ask, but the moment didn't feel right yet. Instead, he smiled and asked about her favorite books, and the topic shifted easily. They compared reading habits, shared favorite authors, and laughed at how both of them never returned borrowed books on time. Hours seemed to pass unnoticed. The cafe was beginning to empty. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets shiny and quiet. He looked at her, feeling oddly at peace. She wasn't just beautiful. She was warm, easy to talk to, and honest in a way that made him forget how nervous he'd been earlier. When she laughed, it felt like a memory coming back to life. He still couldn't be sure if she was the same person he once knew, but something in his heart whispered that fate was playing a quiet trick on him. Eventually, she checked her phone and sighed softly. I didn't realize how late it's gotten, she said. I should probably head home soon. He nodded, though part of him didn't want the evening to end. I had a really nice time, she said sincerely. Thank you for not making it awkward, he laughed lightly. Are you kidding? I was terrified the whole time. That makes two of us, she said, smiling. They both stood and for a moment, just stood there awkwardly by the table, not quite knowing how to say goodbye. I guess we should do this again sometime, she said, almost hesitantly. I'd like that, he replied. They exchanged numbers, and she gave a little wave before walking toward the door. He watched her leave, the small bell above the door chiming softly as she stepped out into the night. For a long moment he stood there, lost in thought. That feeling of familiarity hadn't gone away. In fact, it grew stronger the longer he watched her disappear down the quiet street. He didn't know yet who she truly was, but deep down, something told him that this wasn't the first time their paths had crossed. He gathered his things, placed a few bills on the table, and stepped outside. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. He pulled his jacket closer and walked toward his car, still thinking about her smile, her voice, the way she'd looked at him. He didn't realize it yet. But that night, what began as a nervous blind date was about to turn into something much deeper. Because soon, he would remember exactly who she was, and when he did, everything about that evening would make perfect sense. The next morning, he woke up earlier than usual. He didn't sleep much the night before, not because of bad dreams, but because his mind wouldn't stop replaying the moments from the cafe. The sound of her laugh, the way her eyes softened when she smiled, the way she'd said goodbye like she actually meant it. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he should text her. It hadn't even been 12 hours since they'd met, and he didn't want to seem too eager, but the thought of not talking to her made him uneasy. Finally, he picked up his phone, typed out a simple message. Hey, I had a great time last night. Hope you got home safe. And stared at it for a full minute before hitting send. He tossed the phone aside, half regretting it immediately. A few minutes later, the phone buzzed. I did, thank you. I had a nice time too. "It was fun talking to you," he couldn't help but smile. Her reply was short, but it carried warmth. And just like that, his day felt lighter. As he got ready for work at the bookstore, he kept thinking about her. He didn't even know why exactly. Maybe it was the strange familiarity she carried, that feeling that she wasn't really a stranger. It wasn't just her face, it was her presence, her energy, like they'd shared a story long ago that he couldn't quite remember. At the bookstore, the morning was slow. A few regular customers dropped by, and he helped a young couple choose a gift. But between conversations and shelves of books, his thoughts kept drifting back to her. Around noon, his phone buzzed again. "I was walking past a cafe earlier and thought of last night. That place had good coffee, but the company was even better." He laughed softly. That line could have been from a movie, but the way she said it felt natural, not forced. He typed back, "Then we should test if their coffee's still good sometime soon." A few moments later, she replied with a single smiling emoji. That one small message made him grin like a teenager. 2 days later, they met again, not at the same cafe, but at a quiet park downtown. She suggested it, saying she needed fresh air after a long week at work. When he arrived, she was already there, sitting on a bench near the pond, tossing bits of bread to the ducks. "Hey," she said, smiling as he approached. "You're early." "Couldn't risk being late again," he joked. They laughed, and for a while they just walked together along the path, talking about simple things, work, life, the strange comfort of quiet places. At one point, she pointed to a row of trees at the far end of the park and said, "You know, this place reminds me of where I grew up. We had a park just like this one. There was this huge oak tree that everyone used to climb, and a little ice cream cart that always showed up in the evenings." His heart skipped a beat. That was exactly the same place he remembered from his childhood. He smiled, trying to sound casual. "That sounds familiar. Where was that?" She told him the name of the small town. His breath caught, he knew that name too well. That was his hometown. He stopped walking for a moment, stunned. She didn't notice his silence at first. "It was such a nice neighborhood," she continued. "I moved away when I was around 13, though. My family had to relocate suddenly. I lost touch with everyone from there." He forced himself to stay calm. 13? He repeated slowly. "That's a long time ago." "Yeah," she said softly. "Feels like another lifetime." His thoughts raced. Could it really be her? The girl who used to live down the street from him? The one who always shared her snacks at the park? Who once helped him after he fell from a tree? The same girl who disappeared one day without a goodbye? He wanted to ask her name outright, but he didn't want to scare her or seem strange. Instead, he smiled and said, "It's funny how small the world is. I used to live in a town like that too." She looked at him curiously. "Really? What was it called?" He said the name. Her eyes widened for a brief second before she smiled. "That's the same one. What are the chances?" He chuckled, pretending to be surprised. "Maybe we even crossed paths as kids." "Maybe," she said, her eyes lighting up. "That would be funny, wouldn't it?" He nodded. "Very." As they walked further, she began telling stories about the local bakery that made the best sweet rolls, about the grumpy man who used to yell at kids for stepping on his lawn, about the summer festival that everyone waited for. Each story matched perfectly with his own memories. He didn't interrupt her. He just listened, smiling quietly, letting her voice pull him back in time. When she mentioned the treehouse near the edge of the park, his heart pounded. That was their treehouse. They'd built it together one summer, with crooked nails and stolen planks from her backyard fence. He still had the small scar on his hand from that day. He wanted to show her, to tell her everything, but something held him back. Maybe he wanted the truth to come out naturally in its own time. They spent the rest of the day walking, talking, and laughing. It didn't feel like two people getting to know each other. It felt like two old souls reconnecting after years apart. When it started getting dark, they sat on a bench and watched the orange glow of sunset fade into evening. "It's weird," she said softly, "but I feel like I've known you longer than just a few days." He turned to her, his heart tightening. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I feel that too." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the water, the rustling leaves, and the faint laughter of children in the distance filled the silence. Finally, she turned to him and smiled. I'm glad I didn't cancel that date. He smiled back. Me too. As they stood up to leave, a small drizzle began to fall. They laughed, running toward the shelter near the gate. She grabbed his arm playfully to steady herself, and for a brief moment, their hands brushed. He felt a spark. Not the kind that comes from attraction alone, but something deeper. Recognition. When she looked at him, her eyes lingered on his hand. You have a scar there, she said softly. He froze. Yeah, he said, hiding his hand behind his jacket. Old one, she smiled almost to herself. I used to know someone with a scar in the same spot. He looked at her, his heart racing. Oh, really? She nodded. Yeah, he was a friend from childhood. He got it when he tried to hammer a nail into a treehouse we built. He cried for a minute, but then laughed about it later. Funny how I remember that. He stared at her, the words caught in his throat. She still didn't realize it was him. But he couldn't bring himself to tell her yet. Something about the moment felt fragile, like one wrong word could break the magic of it. Instead, he just smiled softly and said, Sounds like a good memory. It is, she said with a faint smile. Sometimes I wonder what happened to him. He was a kind kid. I never got to say goodbye. He swallowed hard, hiding the emotion in his voice. Maybe he's still around, he said quietly. Somewhere. She looked at him for a long second before nodding. Maybe. The rain stopped soon after and they walked toward their cars. Before leaving, she turned to him and said, Can we meet again? Maybe next weekend? Of course, he said without hesitation. I'd like that. She smiled, waved, and drove off. He stood there for a long time, staring at the road where her car disappeared. His chest felt heavy, but in a good way. It was almost unbelievable. After all these years, the universe had somehow brought them back together. That night, he sat by his window, watching the raindrops slide down the glass, thinking about her words. She remembered him, maybe not fully, but enough for their hearts to recognize each other even before their minds did. He took out an old box from his closet, one he hadn't opened in years. Inside were faded photos, small notes, and a piece of wood from that treehouse. He ran his hand over it, smiling to himself. The past he thought was gone had quietly walked back into his life, wearing the same laugh, the same warmth and the same spark that had once filled his childhood days, and now, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a random date. It was a second chance. A chance to meet the same soul in a new time, a new world, and maybe this time, to never lose her again. The week passed slowly, but his thoughts never drifted far from her. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart would skip, hoping it was her. And most of the time it was. Their messages became longer each day, filled with light teasing, random stories, and those small, honest details people share when they start feeling comfortable. They talked about everything, their favorite songs, their weird food habits, childhood dreams, and even their biggest regrets. But neither of them spoke about the small-town days they both came from. That part still lingered between them, unspoken yet alive. By the weekend, they planned to meet again. This time, she suggested something different, a quiet dinner at a small restaurant by the river. He agreed right away. When he arrived, she was already there, sitting by the window, looking out at the water. She turned and smiled as he walked in, and for a moment he forgot the nervousness that usually came before a date. You're early, she said. Trying to change my reputation, he joked. She laughed. You're doing better than last time. They ordered food, but half the time they barely touched it. Talking to her felt effortless. Every sentence flowed naturally into the next, every laugh came easy. It wasn't like meeting someone new. It was like remembering something that had always been there. Halfway through dinner, she shared something that caught him off guard. You know, she said softly, stirring her drink. I've been thinking about that park I told you about last time, the one from my old town. He looked up, his heartbeat quickening. I actually tried to look it up on the map yesterday, she continued. It's still there. Even that big oak tree is still standing. Isn't that amazing? He nodded slowly. Yeah, some things survive longer than we expect. She smiled faintly, her eyes lost in thought. I used to go there almost every day. I had a best friend back then, a boy from the same street. We used to play under that tree and talk about the future like we knew what it meant. He froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. She didn't notice his reaction. He was so kind. Always tried to make me laugh when I was sad. I never told him, but when my family moved, I cried for weeks because I didn't get to say goodbye. Her voice softened near the end, and for a moment she looked down as if embarrassed by the confession. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. That's a sad way to lose a friend, he said quietly. It was, she said, forcing a smile. But maybe that's life, right? You lose some people and you find others. Still, sometimes I wish I could have told him how much his friendship meant to me. He wanted to tell her the truth right there, to say I was that boy. I never forgot you either. But something held him back again, fear, maybe, or the thought that the right moment hadn't come yet. Instead, he said, if it's meant to be, maybe life gives you a chance to tell him someday. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression soft but unreadable. Maybe, she whispered. The rest of the evening was lighter. They talked about other things, went for a walk by the river, and shared a few jokes. Yet deep down, both of them felt that strange pull, that sense of recognition that neither could explain fully. As they walked under the soft glow of streetlights, the sound of water rippling beside them, she said something that made his heart skip. You know, she began, you remind me of him sometimes. He smiled faintly. The friend from your childhood? She nodded. Yeah, it's the way you listen, and that little smile you do when you're trying not to laugh. He laughed softly, caught off guard. Guess I can't hide that one. They both smiled, but the moment carried more weight than either expected. There was silence for a while, the kind that didn't feel awkward but full of something unspoken. When it was time to say goodbye, she hugged him gently. It wasn't long, but it was enough to leave him standing there after she walked away, wondering how fate had managed to cross their paths again after all those years. That night, as he sat by his window again, he couldn't stop thinking about what she said. You remind me of him. He opened the small box again, the one with old memories from their childhood. This time he took out a faded photograph. It was of two kids standing in front of a half-built treehouse, both smiling widely. The boy's hand was bandaged, the same scar that still marked his skin. The girl had the same kind of bright eyes he saw that night at the restaurant. There was no doubt anymore. It was her. The next few days he tried to figure out how to tell her. He didn't want it to sound dramatic, but he also didn't want it to come out by accident. Each time they met, the words rested on the tip of his tongue, yet he couldn't say them. Then one evening, as they met again at the park, fate decided for him. It was early autumn. The air was cool and the leaves were beginning to change color. They walked slowly, sipping coffee from paper cups, when she suddenly stopped near a familiar oak tree, the same one she'd mentioned before. This looks exactly like that tree I was talking about, she said, except smaller. He smiled, his heart pounding. You think so? Yeah, she said, touching the bark gently. We used to carve our initials on a tree just like this one. I wonder if they're still there. Without thinking, he asked softly. What were the initials? She turned to him, smiling. Mine and his, of course, but that was a long time ago. He hesitated, then took a small step closer. Do you remember what they were? She laughed lightly. Of course. I remember everything about that tree. The initials were, she stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes slowly widened as she looked down at his hand, the scar faintly visible in the fading light. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Wait, he didn't move. He just let her look at him. She stared for a long moment, her hand trembling slightly. It can't be, she said softly. That scar, you... He smiled gently. You said your friend got it while building a treehouse, right? Her eyes filled with tears as she nodded slowly, realization washing over her. It's you, she whispered. It's really you. He nodded, his voice quiet. I was going to tell you. I just didn't know how. For a moment she said nothing. Then she stepped forward and hugged him tightly. He could feel her trembling slightly as she whispered, I can't believe this. All this time. And I didn't even know. He held her close, his voice soft. I didn't think I'd ever see you again. She pulled back, looking up at him with tearful eyes and a shaky smile. You're real, she said, almost laughing through the tears. I thought I'd imagined you half my life, he smiled back. Guess life had other plans. They stood there for a while, the world around them quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves. It felt like time had folded in on itself, the past and present meeting in one small, perfect moment. She shook her head slowly, still in disbelief. I can't believe I sat across from you at that cafe and didn't recognize you. Maybe it took us a little time to remember, he said. But we did. She smiled through her tears. You know, I used to wonder what you'd be like now. What you'd look like. I never imagined this, he laughed softly. Better or worse? Better, she said quickly. Definitely better. They both laughed then, their laughter carrying through the park, the same way it used to when they were kids. That night, neither of them wanted to leave. They sat under the tree until it got dark, talking about their childhood memories, the games they played, the little fights, the time they tried to bake cookies and nearly set the kitchen on fire. It all came back so easily, like no time had passed at all. As they walked back to their cars, she looked at him and said quietly, You know, I used to believe in fate when I was a kid. Then I stopped. But after this, maybe I was wrong to stop, he smiled. Maybe fate was just waiting for the right time. She nodded, her expression soft and full of meaning. Maybe so. When they said goodbye that night, it didn't feel like the end of a date. It felt like the beginning of something that had been meant to happen long ago. Only now, life had finally caught up. The days that followed felt different for both of them. Knowing the truth changed everything, not in a sudden dramatic way, but in a quiet, meaningful one. It was as if all the small, unexplainable moments from before suddenly made sense. The familiar smiles, the ease in conversation, the strange comfort they'd felt from the start. It was all because somewhere deep inside, their hearts had recognized each other long before their minds did. They started spending more time together, not because they planned to, but because they wanted to. It became natural. Morning messages, evening walks, spontaneous coffee breaks, and long conversations that stretched late into the night. One evening, they decided to visit their old town together. It had been years since either of them had gone back. The drive there was filled with soft laughter, and the kind of comfortable silence that exists between people who don't need to fill every moment with words. When they reached the place, the streets looked smaller than they remembered. The bakery they used to visit was gone, replaced by a small shop. The park, however, was still there, a little worn but still full of life. They walked slowly through it side by side. Kids were playing near the swings, just like they once did. The sound of their laughter brought a strange warmth to the air. Everything looks so different, she said softly. He nodded. Except that tree. The same big oak tree stood tall in the middle of the park, its branches wide and heavy with leaves. The treehouse was gone, of course, but the trunk still carried the faint scars of carvings made long ago. Initials, hearts, promises of friendship. She walked closer, brushing her hand against the rough bark. This is where it all began, she said quietly. Feels like another lifetime, he smiled, standing beside her. We were just kids, but somehow it feels like it still matters. She looked at him and smiled back. It does. I think it always did. They sat on the grass beneath the tree, watching the sky shift colors as the sun began to set. For a long time they just talked, about their childhood, their families, and all the years in between. She told him how life hadn't been easy after her family moved away, how she had to adjust to new schools, new people, and how she'd often thought of him when she felt alone. He listened quietly, his heart heavy yet full. I used to come here after you left, he said. I'd sit under this tree and wonder if you were doing okay. I didn't even know where you'd gone. She smiled softly, tears forming in her eyes. If only we had phones back then, she said. Half laughing, half sad, yeah, he said. But maybe if we'd stayed in touch back then, things wouldn't have turned out this way now. She looked at him curiously. You think this was meant to happen? He met her eyes. I think so. Maybe we needed to grow up apart to find our way back. They both fell silent after that. The world around them felt still, the sounds of laughter and rustling leaves fading into the background. Later, as they walked toward the car, she stopped suddenly. Do you ever wonder how life would have been if I never moved? He smiled sadly. I think about it sometimes. But then I realize, maybe we wouldn't appreciate this as much if that hadn't happened. She nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. The drive back was quiet but peaceful. The radio played soft music, and every now and then, one of them would point out something from the roadside, a memory, a funny sign, a passing thought. When they reached her place, she turned to him before getting out. Thank you, she said. for bringing me back here. I didn't know how much I needed it, he smiled. Me neither. As she stepped out, she leaned in for a quick hug, but it lasted longer than either of them expected. It wasn't romantic in the usual way. It was deep, full of years of lost time and newfound understanding. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about how life had led them full circle, how two paths that once split apart had somehow met again at just the right moment. Over the next few weeks, their bond deepened. They met often, sometimes for coffee, sometimes just for a walk. There was no rush, no pressure. They both seemed to understand that what they had was rare, something that needed time and honesty, not speed. One night, they went out for dinner at the same cafe where their story had quietly restarted. The waiter even remembered them. They laughed about it, joking that maybe the cafe was lucky for them. After dinner, they sat by the window again, the same spot where he had nervously waited on that first day. It's funny, she said, smiling. This is where I first met you. Or met you again, I guess. He laughed. Yeah. I was so nervous that day, I almost left before you came in. She looked surprised. Really? He nodded. I thought I'd make a fool of myself. I didn't know that the person walking in would be someone who already knew me better than anyone. She smiled softly. You didn't make a fool of yourself. You made me laugh. That was enough. They sat in silence for a while, both lost in thought. Then she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. You know, I'm scared sometimes, she admitted. I don't want to lose this. Not again. He reached across the table, his voice steady. You won't. We're not kids anymore. We get to choose this time. Her eyes softened. Then I choose to stay. He smiled. So do I. The simplicity of the moment was what made it powerful. There were no big gestures, no perfect words, just two people who had finally found what they'd been missing without even realizing it. From then on, their lives began to blend naturally. They helped each other with small things, grocery runs, fixing things around the house, celebrating little wins at work. Life wasn't suddenly perfect, but it was peaceful, and that felt better than any fairy tale. Sometimes they'd sit together at the park, talking about how strange life was, how everything they'd been through, every choice and every loss, had somehow led them back to each other. I think the universe has its own timing, she said one afternoon, as they watched the sunset. We fight it sometimes, but it always finds a way to set things right. He smiled. You sound like someone who believes in destiny again. She laughed softly. Maybe I do now. He nodded, looking at her with quiet admiration. Then I guess destiny did a good job. Their friendship slowly turned into something deeper. There were no confessions or dramatic moments, just small, real ones. The way she'd hold his arm when crossing the street. The way he'd look for her face in a crowd. The way silence between them felt more meaningful than words ever could. One evening, as they sat together watching the rain, she turned to him and said, Do you think we'll always remember this? The way things started? He smiled. I think we'll remember everything, even the parts we didn't understand back then. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for a long while neither of them said anything. The rain fell softly outside, tapping against the window like a gentle rhythm of time passing peacefully. He thought about how much had changed since that first blind date, how nervous he'd been, how unsure, and now, sitting beside her, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, peace. In her presence, he didn't have to pretend. He didn't have to be anyone else. It was the same feeling he had as a child under that tree, safe, understood, and whole. Later that night, as he dropped her off at home, she turned before getting out and said quietly, You know, I think the best things in life happen when we least expect them. He nodded. I think you're right. She smiled, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the streetlights. Good night, she said. Good night, he replied. As she walked toward her door, he sat there for a moment, watching her disappear inside. He didn't know what the future would hold. None of them did. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to worry. He knew that whatever came next, they'd face it together, not as two people starting something new, but as two souls who had finally found their way back home. The weeks that followed felt like a gentle unfolding of something both familiar and new. Life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it became meaningful in ways that neither of them had expected. Every moment together felt precious, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was real. They continued meeting regularly, sometimes for small things like coffee or walks, and sometimes just to sit in silence, enjoying the comfort of being together. Every laugh, every conversation, every shared glance carried a weight that reminded them of the years they had lost and the years they had now gained. One Saturday morning, he suggested they go on a small road trip to the countryside, somewhere neither of them had been before. She agreed with excitement, her curiosity matching his own. They packed lightly, just a bag each, and drove off with the windows down, the wind carrying a mix of autumn leaves and fresh air. The road stretched ahead, winding between hills and fields, and they talked about everything. Favorite memories from childhood, dreams they had once held, and the small ambitions they had now. She laughed easily, pointing out a stray cow in the field, teasing him about how he probably would have tried to name it. He laughed back, shaking his head. By noon, they found a small lake, the water still and reflective, surrounded by trees just beginning to show the colors of fall. They walked to the edge and sat down on the grass. For a long time they didn't speak. They simply watched the ripples in the water, listening to the gentle sound of birds and leaves rustling in the wind. After a while, she spoke softly. "You know, I never imagined we'd be here like this. I mean, us. Together. I never thought I'd see you again after all those years." He turned to her, smiling gently. "I know. I think I spent a long time wondering the same thing. And now that we are here, it feels right." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the sunlight. "It does. It really does." They stayed by the lake until the sun began to lower in the sky, painting everything in soft oranges and pinks. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he felt a deep sense of peace, the kind that comes when you know exactly where you belong. On the way back, they stopped at a small roadside diner for dinner. It was nothing fancy, but the smell of food and the hum of casual chatter made it feel cozy. They ordered burgers and fries, and laughed over how small their portions looked compared to the mountains of food they used to imagine as kids. After eating, she asked, "Do you think we would have been friends anyway if life hadn't pulled us apart?" He thought for a moment. "Maybe, but I think we wouldn't have understood each other as deeply. We needed time apart to grow into the people we are now. And maybe that's why this feels so effortless." She smiled softly, reaching for his hand across the table. "I like effortless," she said. He squeezed her hand gently. "Me too." The days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Their bond grew stronger not because of grand gestures, but because of consistency. They learned each other's habits. The way she would frown slightly when she was thinking. The way he would hum softly while reading. The small rituals that made them feel connected without needing words. One evening, as winter approached, they decided to decorate his apartment with tiny lights and candles, just for the warmth and comfort. They laughed over the tangle of strings and the stubborn candle holders that refused to stay upright. The whole apartment smelled faintly of pine from a small tree they had brought inside. Sitting together on the couch sipping cocoa, she said quietly, "I never thought life could feel this simple and right. I used to chase so many things, worry about so many things, and now all I want is this, to just be here with you." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I feel the same. We spent so long searching for things that didn't matter, when everything we needed was already waiting for us." She leaned against him, her voice soft. "Do you remember that day in the park? When we really realized who we were to each other?" He nodded. "How could I forget? That moment changed everything." She smiled, her eyes shimmering in the candlelight. "I used to think I had lost my chance with you. But now I realize life gave us a second chance, and I don't want to waste it." Neither of them spoke after that for a while. There was nothing left to say. Silence was enough. Over the following months, they shared ordinary days filled with small joys. Grocery shopping turned into fun adventures. Rainy evenings became cozy movie nights, and long walks through the city brought endless conversation. But it wasn't always perfect. There were small disagreements, misunderstandings about plans, minor irritations, moments when old insecurities bubbled up. Yet they learned to communicate, to listen, and to forgive. Each challenge strengthened their connection rather than weakening it. One Sunday afternoon, they went back to the small park where they had first recognized each other. It had become their little ritual, a reminder of how far they had come. They walked slowly, side by side, noticing the changes in the park, the new swings, the fresh paint on benches, and the faint carvings on the old oak tree, now smoothed by time. They stopped in front of the tree and she looked at him. "You know, it's funny. This tree has seen so much, so many memories, so many people, and somehow it led us back here, back to each other." He nodded, resting his hand on the trunk. "It did. I guess some things are meant to last even when everything else changes." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I feel like we've been given a gift and a chance to rebuild, to start over. And I don't want to take it for granted." He kissed her forehead softly. "Neither do I." As the months passed, their relationship deepened naturally. They didn't rush, didn't feel pressured to label things. They simply enjoyed each other's presence, building a life from trust, laughter, and understanding. Then, one crisp winter evening, as snow fell softly outside, she looked at him with a mix of seriousness and warmth. "Do you ever think about the first time we met at the cafe?" He smiled, remembering the nervousness, the awkward laughs, the slow realization. "All the time. I think about it every day." She reached for his hand. "I'm glad it happened that way. I'm glad we didn't recognize each other right away. It made all the moments before and after even more special." He nodded. "Me too. Every bit of waiting, every misstep led us to now." That night, they stayed up talking about their hopes for the future, about travel, work, family, and dreams they had once set aside. For the first time in a long time, they felt like they could share everything without fear or hesitation. As the clock neared midnight, she leaned against him. "I never want to take this for granted," she said softly. He held her close. "We won't. We'll remember what brought us together and never let go." Over time, their friends noticed the change. People who had seen them separately for years began to comment on how happy they looked together. And they were. Not in a loud, showy way, but in a quiet, steady way that only comes from knowing you found someone who understands and accepts you completely. The years passed. They faced the usual challenges of adult life. Work pressures, family responsibilities, the ups and downs that everyone experiences. But through it all, they had each other, and that made the difference. One evening, as they sat on the porch of his small apartment watching the sun set over the city, she said quietly, "Do you ever think about how we almost missed each other?" He shook his head slowly. "I try not to. I only focus on now, on us, on what we have." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "I think about it anyway, and it makes me grateful. Grateful that we found our way back. Grateful for every little twist that led us here." He kissed her temple gently. "Me too, every single twist. Every twist and turn." They sat in silence for a while, watching the colors fade and the first stars appear. It was peaceful. It was simple. And it was everything they needed. They knew life would continue to throw challenges their way, but they also knew they would face them together. They had been given a second chance and a rare, precious gift. And they weren't going to waste it. In the quiet of that evening, with the world around them still and calm, they felt it fully. That sense of rightness, of belonging, of finding home in another person. They had started as two strangers brought together by fate, and now they were something far more profound, when partners, friends and companions for life. And as they sat there, watching the stars appear one by one, they both silently promised themselves one thing, that no matter what happened, they would always remember the journey. From childhood friends to lost strangers, to rediscovered souls, and they would cherish the love that had patiently waited to bloom.